What is federalism? Federalism is a system of shared sovereignty between two levels of government, for instance, between the national government, and the state government. Our federal government has powers that are separate from the state governments, but there are powers also shared between them. Federalism was created within the Constitution, and that is how a federal government was born. The difference between a federal government and the federal system is as follows. The federal government is the national center government, which is located in Washington, D.C., whereas the federal system is the form of government which is made up of both a national and state government. Please do not mix those up. Some alternatives to federalism. So there's the unitary system, which is a centralized government system in which local governments exercise only those powers given to them by the central government. There's confederal system, which is a league of independent states joined together by a central government that has only limited powers over the independent states. Then in other countries there is federalism, such as Australia, Brazil, Canada, Germany, Mexico, Pakistan, and Switzerland. So we're not the only country that exercises federalism. Division of powers under federalism. In a federal system, powers are divided between the federal government and the state government. The division of powers are laid out to us in our Constitution within our articles and our amendments. There are three powers, or three different types of powers that are granted to the federal government. Our express powers, their applied powers, and their inherent powers. Express powers are constitutionally or statutory powers that are expressly provided for them by the Constitution or by congressional law. So it means it directly says it in the Constitution what they have the power to do. Some examples of that is Congress has the power to coin money. That's both paper money and coin money, unlike the Articles of Confederation. Articles of Confederation would be more of a confederal system when we were talking about the unitary and confederal systems before in a few slides prior. Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce, which is also different than the Articles of Confederation, and that just means the movement of money or goods from one state to another. They also have the 16th Amendment, which allows them to impose a federal income tax. President also has the power to make treaties and appoint certain federal office holders. Whereas implied powers are that are applied by those expressed powers in the Constitution, particularly those that are in Article 1, Section 8, which are the necessary and proper clause. Congress has the power to make all laws necessary, which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing expressed powers and all the powers vested by the Constitution. So basically it means that that Congress has the power to do whatever is necessary in order for them to carry out those expressed powers that we just mentioned. The clause gives them some flexibility to the Constitution, and the right of the federal government to create foreign policy is an example of that. Inherent powers, these are powers that are not always expressly granted by the Constitution, but are necessary to ensure the nation's integrity and survival as a political entity. So they're things that the average local level person or a state level can't really regulate or do. You need to have it provided for you as a whole by your federal government. So some examples of that is regulating immigration, acquiring territory, wage war, and to make peace. The federal government only has a few inherent powers, but they are very important powers, as you can see. So Waukesha can't just start gaining territories. It's the United States federal government that decides whether, for instance, Puerto Rico or not is going to become a state, as well as Puerto Rico obviously votes on that as well. But Waukesha isn't just going to say, okay, you can now be a state. It's a federal decision, not a state level decision. Powers prohibited by the federal government. So these are things that are laid out in the Constitution that the federal government can't do. They can't impose taxes on exports. So if you're exporting something to a different country, you can't put a tax on that. There's sales tax, but an export tax is a little different. You can't pass laws that restrain liberties. So restrain our Bill of Rights. Example of that is freedom of speech or religion. Federal government cannot create a national public school system because it's the state right to be able to regulate their school systems. And prohibited powers are under Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. Powers granted to the state government are police powers, they call them. The powers of a government body that enable it to create laws for the protection of their health, moral safety, and welfare of the people. Police powers are not police officers, so don't get that confused, but they basically just mean that they're policing their state in those areas. Some examples, police powers are written in the 10th Amendment. If you read the 10th Amendment, it basically states that any powers that the federal government doesn't directly have reside in the state powers. Some more examples of that are the states have the right to regulate commerce within their borders. States have the power to maintain a state militia, which is our National Guard. They have the power to establish public schools. That's why there can't be a national public school system. However, we'll get more into how the federal government does provide grants and aid to our public school systems at the state level. States also have the power to regulate marriage and divorce. That's why in some states they have same-sex marriage and in other states they don't. Some states have no-fault divorces, which means regardless or not if you caught your husband cheating or something on you, regardless of that fact, there's no fault. In Wisconsin, for example, which means that it would be just split your assets right down the middle, 50-50. Powers prohibited to the state government. So state isn't allowed to do certain things. So in Article 1, Section 10, it says the powers that are denied to the state government. So a state can't tax goods that are transported across state lines. States cannot enter into treaties with other countries. That'd be a little crazy if Wisconsin was entering into treaties with other countries, because then the rest of the United States would be also having to be part of that treaty. The 13th, 14th, 15th, 19th, 24th, and 26th Amendment also prohibit actions that states can take. We'll get more into the 15th later in the discussion, but that one has to deal with voting. Historically, shows that the states have lost power, but they've been gaining power over the last few years. But the U.S. Supreme Court is the ultimate, they're kind of like the is how they were referred to in the book of the Constitution, and they decide the outcomes and disputes over states, what power states have and what power the federal government has. So interstate relations, so how do our states communicate and relate to one another, and what's their relationship? So this is known as horizontal federalism, so it's sideways rather than up and down like state and federal. So every state has the full faith and credit clause, which just means all public acts, records, and judicial proceedings are supposed to be honored in each state. This causes some controversy because some states might have same-sex marriage, and that couple then might move to a state where they don't have same-sex marriage. So are they seen in the eyes of the law as married or not? There's interstate compacts, which are agreements between two or more states to regulate the use of or protection of certain materials like water, oil, and gas. There's also reciprocity, which are the example for us would be Wisconsin and Minnesota, which allows college students from each state to attend colleges out of state and pay only in-state tuition. So concurrent powers. By definition, these are powers that can be exercised by both the federal and state government. So both state and federal governments can levy taxes. So if you ever look at your paycheck, you pay a state and federal tax. Both states and federal governments can borrow money. They can both charter banks and corporations. They can both make and enforce laws. That's why there's a Wisconsin state statute book. And they can both establish courts. That's why we have several district, federal, and not federal. We have circuit courts and district courts and a Supreme Court, all in Wisconsin. The Supremacy Clause, though, basically says, yes, states have some power. However, no one is above the Constitution because it's the supreme law of the land. So let's look at a Venn diagram real quick, kind of dividing the two. So national, you're looking at the federal government has the power to declare war. They have the power to maintain armed forces, regulate interstate and foreign trade. They can admit new states. They can establish post offices. They can set standards of weights and measures that just has to do with money. They can coin money. They can establish foreign policy. They can make all laws necessary and proper for carrying out those powers. State can establish and maintain schools. They can establish local governments. They can regulate business within a state. They can make marriage laws. They can provide public safety. They assume other powers not delegated to the national government or prohibited to the state government. So long as it's not prohibited, as is written out in the Constitution, and long as it's not a delegated power of the national government, the states have that power. Some shared things are maintaining law and order, levying taxes, borrowing money, chartering banks, establishing courts, and providing public welfare. So dual federalism, so we have two different views we're going to talk about right now. So this view holds that the Constitution is a compact among sovereign states so that the powers of the national and the state governments are clearly different. So it means that it's like a layered cake. So the state has certain things they can do, and the federal government has certain things they do. So the national government rules by enumerated powers only. So not the other two that we had talked about. The national government has a limited set of constitutional purposes, and each government, unit, and nation and state is sovereign only within their sphere. So a state is sovereign just in their things that they have expressed powers on or enumerated powers on. Same with the federal. The relationship between the national and the states is best characterized by tension rather than cooperation. So basically, each government is supreme in its own layer. So I skipped a little bit here. So states first, national rights. So state rights people believe that basically the national government only gets their enumerated powers, and national rights people believe that there are implied powers in order to carry out their enumerated powers. So analogy that's used or metaphor that's used is a layered cake. So as you can see, this has federal, state, local. Metaphor, probably a better word than analogy that I have up there. Cooperative federalism, so it's overlap between state and national functions. So that means they have to work together jointly. So this idea rejects the whole separate layers. So instead they say that they undertake government functions jointly rather than exclusively. They have shared powers. Power is not just concentrated at one level or the other. So this metaphor, rather than an analogy, I should change that up there, is showing you a marble cake. And it means it's cooperative, meaning that there's a lot of shared powers and a lot of joint powers that they have with one another. Federalism today, rather than operating in a mechanical fashion, American federalism is flexible and dynamic system, so more like a cooperative system because of the flexibility of both elected and appointed officials across all levels of the government. There's growing recognition among public officials and citizens that public programs and public problems, cut across governmental boundaries. Sorry, it's not skipping to the next. Okay, so some major it's going a little crazy there. So some major Supreme Court cases you need to know. National government assumed its greatest power during the Great Depression. So from the 1930s to the mid-1990s, the Supreme Court, remember, they get to be the ones who judicially interpret or do judicial review, tended to support expansion of national authority. Only recently has that been limited. So the McCulloch versus Maryland Supreme Court case, basically the things you need to know about this case is the elastic clause, which might be interpreted to mean that Congress can take a particular action not specified, so this is getting into the implied powers in the Constitution, if that action is plainly adapted to achieving a legitimate constitutional end. So this promoted national supremacy and served to increase national power. More Supreme Court cases you need to know is the United States versus Lopez. There are limits to the national government's ability to regulate behavior based on Commerce Clause. In 1995, the Supreme Court concluded that Congress had overreached the legitimate boundaries of commerce power when Congress tried to regulate the possession of guns anywhere near a school. Now, on a state-by-state basis, they can make laws against that, and in our state, it is illegal to carry on school property, regardless if you have a concealed carry license. Then there's the Prince versus United States case, which challenged the Brady Bill. Most sheriffs and local police departments said that they didn't have the money or the manpower basically to implement the regulations that were imposed on them by the national government. This kind of reinforced that the national government needed to work with the state governments and provide funding to them in order to actually make the Brady Bill effective, you could say. So this reinforced the marble cake metaphor we used before. Now we're going to move on to grants and aid. So this is money that comes from your national government. It comes from taxpayers across all 50 states. There's a lot of strings attached to it to ensure that the recipients spend money as specified and that the grant is working. Certain procedures must be followed in order to receive this money, and there's attached restrictions on this money. So there's two different types of grants. There's categorical grants and there's block grants. Categorical grants also can be broken into two different types of categorical grants, and those are formula grants and project grants. Formula grants are distributed according to specific rules that are defined by who is eligible. So they look at state per capita income, they look at the number of school-age children, they look at urban population, they look at the number of families below poverty line. This is like your free and reduced lunch. If a state applies for free and reduced lunch, they're going to look at what amount should the federal government give based on poverty levels, based on your urban population, because that's usually where more of your poverty resides. You have project grants, which have a competitive application process, but they're a lot more broad. They just say you can use them for health, you can use them for natural resources and environment, or you can use them for educational, training, or employment. So it has to fit under one of those subsections. Way less broad, though, than categorical grants is block grants. They're a lot less strict. Basically, all they'll be earmarked for example, is elementary and secondary ed. So if you get federal money that's just marked elementary and secondary ed, it's a block grant, then the school can choose how they're spending it and choose which programs they want to spend that money on. So let's look at some examples of different types of grants. If you look at this website that I provide you here, it tells you, sorry, it's a little cut off on yours. It tells you, if you just want to click on it on your own, it tells you about different project grants, different formula grants, block grants, and categorical grants, and what the difference is between them. So remember, project and formula grants are types of categorical grants, and block grant is something separate. Those are what grants and aid are.